Jacques Zucker, the late modern Romantic American painter, said, "I do not paint for money or from a sense of obligation, nor do I paint for love of success. I paint out of gratitude to God for all the riches he has sent me to enjoy. I paint for my own sake, because for me, art is the surest way to liberty, the way to escape life's problems, though it may create even more difficult ones. For me, art is a personal salvation and a spiritual release." Jacques Zucker was born in Radom, Poland in 1900. As a boy, he fantasized going to the Holy Land and becoming a great hero and painter. In 1913, he made his own way to Palestine and was admitted to the Bezalel Art School in Jerusalem. There, as the youngest student, he produced a great many drawings, paintings, and sculpture, and was highly commended by Professor Boris Schatz, the founder. In 1914, he was offered an art scholarship in Paris, but his good fortune was short-lived, for the Great War had begun. Thus, Zucker was cut off from his family in Poland and any possibility of travel. Realizing his other ambition, in 1917 he joined the Jewish battalion of Allenby's Royal Fusiliers, which drove the Turkish forces out of Palestine. By 1920, it was Paris that beckoned, a world of art with infinite opportunities for both exposure to the masters old and new, and the chance to study at the many academies, museums, and art galleries. At the Left Bank cafes, Jacques Zucker met and discussed art with many rising young painters, Soutine, Kisling, Volovic, and Modigliani, among others. It was hard to make ends meet, but nevertheless, Paris was heaven for an aspiring young artist. In 1922, with Europe deep in the post-war depression, young Zucker emigrated to America. In Ellis Island, having insufficient funds on his person for entry into the United States, he was shunted to the waiting room for deportees. While waiting there, he took out his sketchbook and pastels and drew portraits of the other distressed would-be immigrants. A sympathetic immigration inspector admired these drawings so much that he decided that Zucker would be an asset to his new country. The inspector offered to buy some of the drawings, thus providing Zucker with cash required for entry. For the next 10 years, young Zucker immersed himself in American life, acquainting himself with the many strata of New York society, thoroughly enjoying all its possibilities. His admiration of the openness and honesty found in his new homeland knew no bounds, and his discovery of a beautiful though different landscape led to the creation of many fine paintings. In the late 1920s, an outburst of artistic creativity took over Paris. These were the heady days when young artists from all over the world came to learn and take part in this 20th century renaissance of the arts. Zucker, now established in the United States, joined them, sharing their ideas and enthusiasm, but preserving his notion of himself as a spiritual descendant of Watteau via Renoir. In Montparnasse, as in New York, he preferred to paint the natural aspect of people and places rather than resorting to formal poses and artificial staging. It was in this period that he forged his links with the École de Paris, a post-impressionist movement that rejected the inroads of Cubism and abstract expressionism, but went beyond impressionism in new techniques and evocation of light and color. He further perfected his style in Spain and Palestine. By the fall of 1932, at the depth of the Depression, the Zuckers returned to New York and hard times. During this period, he became involved in many WPA projects. The grimness of the era was reflected in the poignant quality of many of his works, such as The Eviction and Sad Lady. But soon he rediscovered the romantic qualities of America's towns and countryside. Although he accepted portrait commissions and assignments, his overwhelming preference was to paint and draw subjects of his own choosing. For many years, the Zuckers spent their summers in Croton-on-Hudson, New York, and Ridgefield, Connecticut. Later, they went to Rockport, Massachusetts, an artists' colony whose well-known scenery glowed in Zucker's interpretations. The end of the war brought the family the occasion to return to their beloved Paris. After a 15-year absence, Zucker fell to painting everything in sight: Notre Dame, the Seine bridges, the street markets. Everything inspired and delighted him. By 1948, the Zuckers were installed in a house with a large painter's studio in the Paris suburb of Arcueil. Many artists and sculptors had their studios in this quaint town, with its old-fashioned cafes and tree-lined streets bordered by houses built in the 18th and 19th centuries. From 1948 on, Zucker divided his time between homes in New York and Arcueil. During this time, he made many painting trips to Israel, Italy, Spain, Holland, and Mexico. In Israel, he painted mostly in Jaffa, Jerusalem, and Safed. His favorite subjects in France, to which he would return again and again, would be the bridges of Paris and scenes in Vaux-Allons. From Bièvre, an 18th century suburb of Paris, came several paintings of women in flower fields. He also painted in Moret-sur-Loing, where Sisley spent his later years.
I met Jacques, I think, in 46 or 47. I was an art critic of United Press, and I went around to see the galleries, which was much easier because there were not 600 galleries, and there were so many artists. I liked his work very much. Later we met, and I was very favorably impressed. An artist who was modest, soft-spoken, very cultured. It was a pleasure to have an exchange of ideas with him. The times were very uncertain, as they usually are in art. The great masters of the Paris school, Picasso, Braque, Matisse, still did wonderful things, but they were not alone. In the meantime, we had German expressionism, surrealism, and now in the 40s, abstract expressionism is pushed forward. But Jacques was not in any way impressed by all these things. you really couldn't pigeonhole him. He was an individualist.
In Collioure, a coastal village in the French Pyrenees, previously discovered by Matisse, Derain, and Mayol, he found the rugged fisherman and savage landscape irresistible subjects. There were also trips to Italy, from the luminous seaports of the north to the fantastic landscapes and sun-drenched colors of the south.
I think he went around many countries, but he always painted his dream. It was a very harmonious painting, which appealed to you by its sincerity, by its, of course, its excellence, and somehow this warmth, this human feeling that was in it. And this is well loved. It is, of course, not the only way. Artists, those are very aggressive artists. Some of the Goyas, some of the bushes were not very likable, but both are possible. And this is, Jacques really painted how he was, very sincere. And that is the modern way.
In 1950, the Tel Aviv Museum of Modern Art gave Zucker a retrospective one-man show. 20 years had passed since his last major exhibition in Israel. Jerusalem, Jaffa, and Safed provided anew the opportunity to paint many of the scenes and familiar faces which he had treasured in his memory since his departure from Betzalel.
Oh, the girl with the broom was a little Yemenite girl who was sweeping her stoop in Jaffa. I think it was about 1950, maybe a year or two after independence. And my father had actually stopped not so much to look at her, but because her mother was listening to a portable radio playing an old Jimmy Durante record. And he was fascinated by the idea of someone who didn't understand any English actually listening to this. And then he thought the kid was so cute, he asked her if she'd pose for him. And she asked her mother, who agreed, and he offered her some money. And the sweet little thing said no, she couldn't take money from a poor man. And he asked her, well, why do you think I'm poor? And she said, well, you're making pictures with little cheap brushes and other people have cameras.
A great aficionado of Spain, Zucker painted with gusto the somber landscape of the Tajo River in Toledo, the rural greenery and seascapes of Colunga in Asturias, the twisted olive trees and medieval streets of Mallorca, and the Moorish city of Granada. He was elated by the drama of the Goyesque scenery, by the loveliness of Spanish women, and the manly carriage of the rural horsemen and fishermen. He treated himself to long visits to the Prado Museum in Madrid, feeling very much at home among the masters. He was also attracted by the colonial towns of Mexico, especially Tasco, with its steep, narrow streets and red-tiled roofs, tumbling with bougainvillea. Here, Zucker was fascinated by the luminous color harmonies so different from those in the United States and Europe. He loved to paint and draw in the marketplaces where the local townsfolk willingly posed for him. He often shared models with the Mexican painter Figueroa.
Pissarro in a letter to his son, he was also a painter, wrote, "Don't paint the landscape, paint the poetry of the landscape." And this is what Jacques did. He had a dream, and this dream changed the objects. But every artist does that. When you go and see the water lilies of Monet, the water lilies don't look like that. It's the dream, the poetry of Monet which is in them. Jacques' art is very French. The French philosophy of life is of a simple life. There is a beautiful French poem which I tried to say in English, life is short, a little love, a little hatred, a little hope, a little dream, and then it's out. This was the French life. And this life Jacques painted.
Over the years, Zucker held 28 one-man shows in the United States and abroad, and also participated in national shows and College Art Association exhibitions. He was a member of the Federation of American Painters and Sculptors. In addition to his flair for oil painting, he also excelled in gouache and pastel, as well as beautifully executed drawings in sanguine and burnt sienna. The French poet André Speer wrote, "Jacques Zucker, of all the artists I know, is the least dogmatic." At a time when intellectual art appears to dominate the scene, stripping the world of its flesh and blood, reducing it before our eyes to a mere skeleton structure, this painter, Zucker, simply and with love, puts before us trees, flowers, landscapes, children, and people. He works upon them. He yields to them. He lets himself be dominated by the sheer beauty of the world. Little by little, his brush animates everything, makes everything vibrate, as if each painting existed first within the artist's soul, and his chief mission was to transpose the image to canvas with the tints of the original vision.
Jacques Zucker was an individualist. He painted his own dream. He painted the poetry he saw in the world, which we laymen don't see. We see only the vulgarity, the corruption, the hypocrisy. But the artist projects his own dream into his subject. And what is what Jacques did?
Not even 2 cataract operations dimmed his love of painting. With age and illness, he spent more and more time at his home in New York, although he still managed an occasional trip to Mexico and France. By 1981, with diminished health, he would gaze fondly at the West Side rooftops from his bedside window. Jacques Zucker died in New York on March 13th, 1981, leaving a legacy of paintings and drawings to enrich the world.